Hello, everyone. First of all, I invite you to take your seats to be able to start. I've been told that lunch is after that, and I've heard that they are planning to postpone lunch if we don't get on with it now. So let's do that. My name is Ahmed Abudouh. I'm the head of China Studies Unit at EPC and Associate Fellow with Chatham House in London. Let me start by thanking Dr. Ibtisam Al-Kidbi and my colleagues at EPC for organizing such a great event as usual. The kickoff was great. The panel before us was very important, not just because it was the first panel, but also because it nicely laid the groundwork for us to build on what has been discussed before us by these great analysts. And this is important because the world order that has been discussed cannot be reflected perfectly in any other place than Asia. That's because the strategies of the regional powers, the global powers, and alliance building will most likely, at least in my view, determine the shape of the the international order in the future. And because we are discussing such a huge question, I'm delighted today to be joined by a panel of celebrity experts, high caliber scholars and policy practitioners who spend tremendously long time thinking about these questions and addressing them. Here to my left is Dr. Victor Gao. He is the chairman of the China Energy Security Institute and the chair professor of Zhou University and vice president of the Center for China and Globalization. Next to him is Mr. Sunjoy Joshi. He is the chairman of the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. He is also a visiting associate at the International Institute of Strategic Studies in London and a distinguished visitor to the program on energy and sustainable development at the University of Stanford in the United States. And last but not least, my friend, Senior Colonel Zhou. He's a senior fellow of the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University and a China Forum expert. Before we start, let me address the elephant in the room. That is President Trump's sweeping victory in the United States elections. This is very important. Whether you like him or not, you are absolutely entitled to hold whatever opinion and view on him. This room in particular has been welcoming and accommodating of all opinions throughout the years. But for me as a moderator, his victory is both good and bad news. Good news because none other than Trump can make international affairs that spicy, interesting, and sometimes volatile and chaotic. And this is important for scholars and experts because it forces us to get out of our comfort zone and try to roll out some new takes and ideas on international affairs and especially Asia. It is bad news because inevitably all our discussions throughout these days will be influenced by this event. So I encourage myself and our speakers to, of course, dissect the short-term implications of that without losing sight of the long-term trends and dynamics. One of these dynamics is that Asia is a super region in transition. And I really like the title of this panel because whoever put this title captured it very well. It is a chessboard. In East Asia, you've got China, a major power, great influence all over the world through its BRI initiative and more recently, other initiatives such as the GSI, GCI, and GDI as well, adopting a more assertive, sometimes coercive approach in the South China Sea and around Taiwan Strait. But at the same time, it is going through tremendously harsh economic headwinds while it is trying to restructure its growth model. You also have the United States, which the previous distinguished speakers touched on. It is the dominant military power in East Asia, with its vast military deployments and network of alliances, but also it seems, or it looks like a confused power, oscillating between presidents who hold completely different views on Asia, which makes the United States look as if it's unable to find or figure out the best way to maintain this dominance. Also, it has allies such as Japan and Australia going through aggressive military buildups, trying to shape the economic and security order in East Asia through multilateral alliances. And then you have Southeast Asia, countries who want to be in the middle. They don't want to be the battlefield of the showdown between these major powers. And then when you go to South Asia, you have India, which is a rising power with the ambitions to join the exclusive club of great powers, more assertive and aggressive towards China, aligning itself a bit by bit with the United States, but without losing its strategic autonomy policy, keeping relations very good with even hostile powers to the United States, including Russia. And Russia is the newcomer, old and newcomer to East Asia with its military alliance with North Korea, which is very interesting. So the main question this panel is interested in addressing is, what are the implications of militarization, competition, and alliance building on Asia? And later in the panel, what are the implications on where we are now, the Gulf states? So before I start, I need to get some housekeeping essentials out of the way. I will engage my speakers in a question and answer conversation, and at the end, I'll open the floor for our audience to ask their questions. If you want to ask any question, please identify or introduce yourself, your affiliation, and the name of the speaker you want to ask a question to. So let me start with you, Colonel Zhou. And I'm very interested in the recent developments in the defense relationship between China and the United States. And you have great experience in that. As I mentioned before, the US military deployments in East Asia have increased under President Biden. And military alliances such as Quad and AUKUS popped up and have been supported as well. But since President Xi Jinping and President Biden met in person in November 2023, we have seen improvement, more stability in the defense relations between both countries, to the extent that they reached an agreement in September to resume communications between both militaries at the theater commander level. How do you see the implications of Trump's win or victory over the future defense relations between both countries?
Talking about a China-US military relationship, I think I'm right to say that neither side wants a conflict. But the point is, if we want to have a kind of guardrails, this kind of guardrails are very difficult to be established. Why is that? Because during the Cold War, the strength of the United States and the Soviet Union is more or less the same. But this is not the case between the United States and China. But this is a complicated picture. China has no intention to compete with the United States elsewhere. I mean, away from Chinese land and Chinese waters. But near the first China Island, China does have a growing strength that the United States find it difficult to accommodate. So on one hand, this kind of strength is getting closer to each other, but on the other hand, in the rest of the world, we do not have the intention to compete with that. But what matters is near our doorstep. So this kind of a relationship is getting volatile. Let's talk about Taiwan. On the Taiwan issue, I think the good thing is the Chinese government has not lost hope. People always ask me, okay, how to resolve this issue? My answer is very simple. Just let Beijing believe that peaceful reunification is still possible. If we believe it is still possible, then we will not use force, right? So if we believe peaceful reunification is not possible, then we have to think about the use of force. So as far as the Biden administration is concerned, So as the Trump administration is concerned, they talk about how Taiwan would have to pay more for protection from the United States. What does that mean? It's not a blank check from Taiwan to say, okay, this is what you want. Okay, fill it in with whichever sum you want. This is your protection fee, okay? So protection fee may just come as more American arms sales to Taiwan, right? And that would make mainland China more frustrated. And we are going to do something, definitely. I mean, it's not a direct attack, but see what happened. Every mistake, either on the side of Washington or on the side of Taipei, would be examined by us carefully. And we're going to do something. And that may change the status quo irreversibly in the favor of the mainland. I'll give you an example. What happened after Nancy Pelosi's visit? We changed the status quo. We've sent aircraft to fly across the medium line, and this has become more frequent, and this won't be reversed. Thank you.
That's very interesting. Although we jumped the gun a little bit on Taiwan, but it aligns neatly with my second question to Mr. Joshi on the same subject, because President Trump might have unintentionally given the nod to China when he said that he will not use military power to deter China from making a military move on Taiwan. But he will prefer to use tariffs and taxes. Some would argue that this might be exactly what China wanted to hear, or not. I'm very interested to hear your view, but not from the perspective of the United States more, but from the perspective of India, of course, first and foremost, and also its allies and partners in Asia.
Ahmed, you've asked me this question, and you've positioned me between a Chinese speaker to my right and a Chinese speaker to my left. Okay?
That was intentionally done.
Intentionally, strategically. That is where you've placed me. And if you look at the map of India, that is precisely where India is. We have China to our north, we have China to our east. We share a 3,500 kilometer long border with China. We have to live with our neighbor. We have problems, and those problems are historical, they're legacy problems, and we have resolved them from time to time as we move forward. You recently witnessed what happened in Kazan. After all the skirmishes we've had and a lot of acrimony between the two nations, there was some kind of a solution or a compromise reached.
I would like, sorry to interrupt you, but I would like to come back to this because I'm actually interested in that and I want to expand on it.
Yeah.
But let's start first with East Asia,
Yeah.
the militarization around Taiwan.
See, as far as the militarization around Taiwan is concerned, India, in the larger policy, as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned, there are similarities in the position of the US and India, and there are key differences. For India, the Indo-Pacific does not just stop from, Bollywood to Hollywood. The Indo-Pacific is a much larger construct, which extends, and India's core interests in Indo-Pacific are, yes, there are a core interest in the East, but there are far deeper concerns which India has to its west in the Indo-Pacific. And that is where India has differences with the US. On the East, yes, there are many similarities, very common points, which we share with the United States of America. But when we look at the larger construct of the Indo-Pacific, our view of the Indo-Pacific is not the same as that of the Pacific Command. So there are the subtle differences which you have. And India has made it very clear time and time again that it does not view the Indo-Pacific as a security architecture. It looks at it as a much larger, not just security. For India, security is not just a binary vision of defense security. It's a security which encompasses economic security, security of shipping lanes, security of transition, energy security, and that is a much larger vision of security which we share with many other countries in the region. And that is where we are at pains to explain, both to the Chinese and to the Americans, that yes, we are part of the Indo-Pacific, but still we are not part of the AUKUS. We are out of the AUKUS. We are out of very pure defensive structures of engagement. So you must understand this, and our outlook towards Taiwan remains the same.
Well, because we are at it now, and this is a very interesting explanation of how India sees the Indo-Pacific, but as you alluded earlier, the meeting between President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Narendra Modi was very, very interesting and actually unexpected, and a lot of people were taken by surprise by it. A lot of people exaggerated it as a final solution of the border issue, but also decisions like opening the Indian market for Chinese companies to come gradually in and end the restrictions on investments was also very important and interesting. How do you see the relationship not only between India and China, but the nexus of China, India, the United States? How do you in India balance this relationship?
See, we are very clear on one aspect, and especially after the results of the presidential election in the United States of America. We are, yes, moving into a much more transactional world. And relationships between countries are going to be defined by many of these transactional engagements. That is the broader mandate which the US election really meant. That meant the same thing in 2016. Then after that, we saw continuation of US policies towards China. And there is ambiguity again in the relationship between both these powers as far as the trade relationship goes. You cannot live without China. You can't live with them. You can't live without them. And people have, especially after COVID, kept on talking about more resilient supply chains. You talk about friendshoring. You talk about nearshoring. The thing is that in this connected world, supply chains have got so entangled, so deeply complicated, that you do not know where one country's interest begins and the other's ends. So supply chains, yes, are reconfiguring. The geometry of trade is changing by reconfiguring of supply chains. But these changes do not necessarily reflect the intentions of the powers who are trying to reconfigure them. They have their own logic. And that logic is going to play out more and more. So what are you finding, if you start looking at the whole pattern, what do you see happening across Asia? See, both ASEAN, which is the ASEAN countries, and also South Asia, supply chains are, yes, definitely reconfiguring. But they are more reconfiguring as becoming the connectors between diverse partners, former partners who no longer want to really talk to each other, who are today engaged in kind of trade attrition with each other, slapping tariffs. The reconfiguring of supply chains actually is working to rebuild connections. And that is where I think many Asian countries are today positioning themselves. So when you start understanding the very complex relationship, which you find ASEAN countries, many of the countries in this part of the world, including India itself, with China and with the US, please understand that. The world, the geometry of trade is changing, but not necessarily changing in ways which maybe the US wants or maybe even the way China wants.
That's very interesting, because the idea of reconfiguration of supply chain might actually materialize after Trump's victory, because he essentially threatened to impose 60% tariffs on Chinese goods. And I would like to go back to the United States-China relationship with Dr. Gao, because as you know, President Xi Jinping repeated his emphasis many times on the high quality development over the fast growth rates. And the National People's Congress Standing Committee just approved a huge stimulus package to reach the growth target of 5% this year and also reinvigorate the economy. On the tech side, President Xi Jinping put forward interesting concepts like new quality productive forces, self-reliance in science and technology to be able to survive the expanding Washington export restrictions on advanced technology. But after Trump's threatening to impose this huge tariffs, I think we will see recalibration of supply chains in the whole region. We will see acceleration of decreasing reliance by international companies on China, diversification, and a lot of other dynamics. How do you see these things?
Thank you, Ahmed. First of all, allow me to thank EPC, headed by the distinguished Madam Director, for organizing this 11th AD-SD session. I think this conference cannot take place at a better time. It's just in the aftermath of the results of the US presidential election. Now, also allow me to congratulate Donald Trump for being elected in such a decisive win in domestic politics in the United States. And now the Republican Party is in control not only of the White House, but also of the Senate, of the House of Representatives, and President Trump and the Republican Party probably have greater influence at the Supreme Court level and other federal court levels. So I think in the coming 4 years, starting on January the 20th, President Trump will shake up the United States as well as shake up the world. And most of us are holding our breath as to see what President Trump will do or will not do. As far as China-US relations are concerned, Donald Trump has threatened to go maximum in terms of imposing tariffs on Chinese export to the United States. But allow me to mention one thing. Trump never tells the American people who pays these tariffs. China doesn't pay any single penny of the tariffs imposed by the United States on Chinese export to the United States. The tariffs, whether 25% or 50% or 60%, or as threatened up to 100% for the EV cars, are paid in its entirety by the American people. The high tariffs imposed on Chinese exports to the United States is one of the reasons why inflation runs high in the United States, and high inflation erodes the living standards of the American people. In a sense, the higher tariffs imposed by the United States government under President Trump before, now under Biden, and to be imposed again by President Trump, will cause high inflation in the United States. It's not sustainable. Now, Ahmed, you talked about reconfiguring the supply chain. The supply chain is never carved in stone, but Rome is not built overnight. China spent the past 46 years in economic reform, opening to the outside world. So if you really want to change the supply chain, to squeeze China out of the supply chain, you probably need to spend another 46 years to come to change it. And the world is changing. I think the fact that President Xi Jinping keeps talking about the new qualitative productivity, which is a tongue twister in itself, really means China needs to rely on technological breakthrough, on scientific breakthrough to increase, boost its own productivity, and completely changing the ways of doing things in China. From the Chinese perspective, let me tell you how China looks at the world right now. China believes AI revolution is real, and AI revolution will completely shape the world. And the real competition is not between China versus the United States. The real competition is between AI on the one hand, which is changing rapidly, versus Homo sapien. All of us are Homo sapien. So if China and the United States really just compete, especially in the AI sphere, the ultimate winner may not be China or the United States. It may be AI. AI may gain its own independence and its own conscience and subjugate all of us, human beings, as a second-class citizen. What's the fun of that? China and the United States, the two leading countries in AI revolution, eventually need to come to terms with how they need to cooperate rather than confront each other or a zero-sum game to kill each other using AI as the instrument. So from the Chinese perspective, we welcome Donald Trump, and we actually highly appreciate the fact that Donald Trump declared to the world that for the 4 years when he will be the next president of the United States, he will not use war as an instrument to solve any international issues. I hope President Trump will be serious about it. And I would really highly recommend that if he achieves that, he should be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Really, he will really make a very important legacy for mankind if he can prevent the United States from engaging in war, direct or indirect, proxy war of all kinds in the world. So let's wait and see, let's hold our breath to see whether President Trump will really do miracles to preserve peace and avoid using war. Other than that, tariff war, China is very confident. Why? Because if Trump has a way to force China to pay 100%, 60% of the tariffs the US government imposes on China, China will feel the pain. But it's paid by the American consumers. It fuels inflation. So I hope President Trump will really know economics ABC and realize that using tariff can make you happy instantly, but it may deprive you of your sanity in the longer term. Thank you.
That's a very interesting take from a Chinese scholar on Trump. I admit I didn't hear that before, and I think I will keep an eye on this, on the development of this argument. I would like to go back to Colonel Zhou, and I want to bring ASEAN and South China and Southeast Asia into our conversation, because the previous panel laid out the dynamics quite nicely when they stated that there is quite a high level of balancing going on against the military alliances building up now, including the AUKUS, for example, which spooks a lot of people in Southeast Asia. But let me counter and say that there is also a lot of balancing going on from these countries towards China, especially countries with disputes in South China Sea, including Philippines and Vietnam and other countries. Why, and let me be the devil's advocate, why China is not doing a great job in taking advantage of this balancing vis-a-vis the United States and bringing these countries closer? Why China is doubling down on its assertive posturing in the South China Sea?
Well, I think China has already done a good job. Otherwise, as Samir said at the last session, China even has gained a more favorable, popularity in Southeast Asia. Then why is that? We didn't wait for that to happen because we work on that. The second reason is because of one word, Gaza. Yeah, I was wondering, but for Gaza, but for the public resentment in two Muslim countries, Indonesia and Malaysia, how could China have a 0.5% higher approval rate than the United States for the first time in the last 5 years? So this kind of, public opinion poll, however pleasant to China, would really not matter that much. But it's true that Southeast Asia right now is China's largest trading partner. We're actually talking about an American alliance, right? So the United States boasts about 60 allies and partners. But I have been thinking about one question. If in the worst scenario of China and the United States come into conflict in Taiwan Strait, how many countries would be really helping the United States? I counted. It's so easy for me to count. My answer is less than 5. And each one of them have their own problems. Starting with Japan. Japan has treaty obligations to provide logistical support to the United States. But when Japan would have to have a direct conflict with China, the Japanese public opinion is no. Then come to Australia, right? Australian government has made it clear that although we want to buy 8 nuclear-powered submarines from the United States, but we would not be involved in a conflict in the Strait of Taiwan. This is the official position of the Australian government right now. Then who is next? Probably Philippines, right? The Filipinos have provided 9 military bases for the use of the United States, but on certain conditions. Yeah, for example, no storage of ammunition and not to use it during wartime. So these kind of things could never be answered unless we have a real war. But it shows how regional countries, even the die-hard American allies, are really, really worried about a conflict with another nuclear weapon state. So in the Asia-Pacific, okay, let me talk a bit about India. Even if we had some, sour relationship because of a deadly clash, without using a weapon in Galvan Valley, I myself have a lot of confidence in the independence of India's foreign policy. I know, even at that time, that India's, tilting toward the United States is a tactical move, because India considers itself to be a major power. Because India has a tradition of long alliance. So it will never, get so close to the United States to the extent that it will backfire in its relationship with China. Now, with this relationship much more improved, if I look down the road in another 40 years, why do I say 40 years? Because we have a peace, for over 40 years. So if I look down the road, I believe we could maintain peace and stability for another 40 years along the line of actual control. Everybody would say that, okay, this kind of conflict between China and India is so terrible. That's true. But there is something positive in it. That is, for the 2 largest modern militaries in the world, we didn't try to shoot at each other. We were only fighting with the fist, with a wooden club, or even with some iron clubs. But still, that is much better than firing at each other. That means both sides know deeply, and even subconsciously, that we should not fire at each other at any time. And so this is a bottom line. And building upon this bottom line, I have my good hope for this most important relationship in Asia and in the world.
Thank you for that. And it is a popular idea nowadays, especially in China. But I would like to challenge you on this because, yes, they didn't shoot at each other, but the differences are still there and very deep between China and India. For example, the Kazan meeting, if you read the 2 statements, you will see the difference and divergence. For example, China doesn't recognize or didn't recognize in this statement, and as we know, a long-term conviction, the multipolarity in Asia, while India calls all the time for multipolarity. So in the United States as well, there is a consensus that India is a long-term partner, as much as a consensus that China is a long-term rival. There's also an idea in China that the United States will never come to India's rescue in the case of conflict between India and China. And I would like to go to Mr. Joshi on this, because the Indian view on that is very interesting. Because on the one hand, India is part of BRICS, right? And it keeps the door open for its relationship with China, but also Russia. But on the other hand, it is part of Quad, okay? And it shares a lot of the United States' preferences and views in Asia. So what is the Indian vision for the Asian order going forward?
The Indian vision is very clear. In a world which is going more and more binary and trying to define relationships in terms of he is with us and this one is against us, and forcing people to choose between each other, India's position is there are no barriers. We will talk to everybody. And if you see the pattern of India's relationships, it has been functioning as a bridge builder across a lot of these geographies. And it is not just India, you see, if you look at the larger picture, this is also true of countries in the ASEAN. This is also true of countries in this part of the world, the progressive Gulf states moving forward so rapidly. They do not want to be caught in this tangle because they do not see the world as a binary world. This is not the world of 1945. This is not the world of the 1960s.
But in the context of the US-Indian relationship, isn't that India trying to have its cake and eat it?
Pardon?
Isn't that akin to India having its cake and eat it? They want a military partnership, intelligence sharing, technological deep partnership with the United States, but at the same time, they want to keep stability in their relationship with China and even sign an agreement and get closer and allow Chinese companies to invest in India. So what is it exactly from an American point of view? They can turn around and say, well, what are you doing here?
We are doing what we've been doing very effectively right from 1955, since Bandung, which is fundamentally saying that there is the possibility of everyone having a piece of this cake. And the real emphasis as far as India is concerned, see, countries like India, countries like ASEAN, countries in West Asia and across Africa waiting in the wings, these are forward-looking countries. They're not looking back. They have the power of youth. They have the power of dynamism. They have to move forward. They will continue growing. And they do not grow at their own peril. So for them to keep the engines of the economy churning, that's why I said right in the beginning that for us security is a much larger concept. It is not security defined in terms of arms and war and armaments. It is security defined in terms of progress, peace, and harmony for everybody, because that is the only way these countries can move forward. So we are forward-looking countries. So it is not about having our cake and eating it too. It is making people understand that there is nuance. There is nuance to all these relationships. And you cannot be in a situation, whether it is in Ukraine, whether it is in West Asia, where you are not even willing to conduct basic diplomacy and talk to each other, where you try to play cancel politics and try to cut out the other one through either sanctions or you even through completely sabotaging the interbanking system, the SWIFT system, which has had disastrous consequences on most of the developing world. So if South Asia, the global South is apprehensive today, and we understand those apprehensions, they are apprehensive because they do not like what they see. So they would definitely like to move into a very, very, very different kind of world, which that is what we're really trying to do. Whether we try to do it as being part of the BRICS, whether we try to do it as part of the SCO, whether we even try to do it as part of the Indo-Pacific and the IPF and all these other arrangements, IMEC, which we're all part of. Let us come together. Let us please come together.
Dr. Gao, you want to say something about that?
Yeah, Ahmed, if you allow me to make several very brief points about China, India, and the United States. I think as far as the United States is concerned, its best case scenario is to tie India onto the American bandwagon of anti-China hostility. Now, for India to be tied onto the US bandwagon of hostility against China would be a nightmare, because China and India each has a population of more than 1.4 billion people, and they are neighbors to each other, thousands of kilometers of common boundary. And if war breaks out between China and India, you are talking about a war involving close to 3 billion people in the world. There will be no more peace for the rest of the world. And I always tell my Indian friends, and I have high admiration for India as a nation, the worst enemy of India is not China. The worst enemy of India from a war perspective, and we have Colonel Zhou, formerly with the PLA in China, the worst enemy for India in terms of war is the Himalayas, because New Delhi is only about several hundred kilometers away from the mighty Himalayas. The Himalayas rises up from low altitude all the way to about 7,000 meters, if not 8,000 meters above sea level. Now, in any warfare, and I'm not a military expert by any stretch of the imagination, you always capture the high ground. You capture the peak, etc. So, from the Indians' perspective, if you want to fight a war against China, China is not your enemy. The Himalaya will be your enemy because you are shooting all the way to the sky as if. And if you cross the Himalaya, it's not plains, it's not lower altitude plains. You are talking about the Tibetan plateau, thousands of kilometers to the north. So you are talking about a military impossibility if you are talking about the war between China and India. Now, if the United States, and I hope not under President Trump, of course, encourages India to fight a war against China, you need to overcome the mighty Himalayas. You travel throughout the world, you travel throughout the Arab Peninsula, etc. You see no such terrain as you have to confront the mighty Himalayas. So for China and the Indian people, the two superpopulations, let's talk about peace. And we keep talking about these territorial disputes between China and India. The China-Indian disputes were not created by India, and they were not created by China. Who created these territorial disputes? The British colonists, when they ruled India in the form of British Indian Empire. And neither China nor India should be held hostage by the British Indian colonists who want to push the boundary of India into Tibet, into Xinjiang, into many other directions, etc. And the Indian people should never expect that you can achieve goals laid out by the British Indian colonists that the British Indian colonists failed to achieve in their own way. So let's talk about peace rather than war between China and India. That's the only right way for these two great nations.
Mr. Joshi, please.
Yeah, just a quick corrective. You see, the conflict between India and China, see, the military conflict is, I would push that to the side. There are other problems too between China and India. And trade, yes, is a region where there's a problem. India's trade with China is hugely unbalanced. It is not the kind of trade which can continue forever. And one of the pressure points between India and China always has been the kinds of barriers which China keeps putting up to exclude certain kinds of trade with India. And that's a problem which most of the world has with China. So there India does make common cause with a lot of other similar countries who are in the same dilemma, which includes countries in Europe, which includes the United States of America. We have a problem. We have a trade problem with China. It's an uncontrollable surplus. It is a one-way trade which just keeps on burgeoning, growing and growing, and the kind of dumping which starts taking place. As China gets into a situation where they have tremendous overcapacity, when this keeps trying to flood markets, it does have an effect on the Indian economy. So that is the second leg of the problem we have with China, and many other countries have that problem.
Final one, and please.
I'll be very quick.
Yeah, very brief. Because
I'll be very quick. While I have high admiration for India, as I mentioned, back in 1978, in terms of the size of the economy, China and India were more or less at par with each other. But today, China is completely different from India. The size of the Chinese economy is more than 5 India combined. That means India is less than 20% of the Chinese economy. So, talking about China and India, China must have done something tremendously right over the past 46 years to really leap forward ahead of India as a size of the economy. And I hope Indian friends will really catch up. And eventually, China and India will be in the top 3 largest economies in the world. The sooner India achieve that goal, the happier I will become.
The US economy is far larger compared to China. But if you start looking at trade patterns with the US, India enjoys a trade surplus with the US. It's a much more balanced trade. And that is something which always brings the two countries together. Right. India depends on the US for balancing its trade.
This is fascinating, actually. This exchange happened because it shows me the Chinese, that I believe, the Chinese vision of India in the picking order of powers in Asia, and how they see the India's journey and development. But I want to move on to my last question in this part of the world before moving to the Gulf, to Colonel Zhou, and it's very short. It was very interesting to see the relationship, the military alliance between Russia and North Korea, which, in my view, could throw a spanner in the works of every power we just mentioned. What is the assessment of China of this partnership, and does it see it with skepticism or does it endorse it?
You see, the Chinese government so far is having a measured, response toward this kind of allegation, because North Korea didn't admit that it had to send troops, to Kursk over Russia. But I have my own assessment. In one word, North Korea would not be a game changer in the battlefield of Europe. Why is that? Because Russia is already having an upper hand. So sending some North Korean troops to help Russians would be tactically useful, but it would not be that significant. The only beneficiary is Kim Jong-un. Why is that? Because even by sending 12,000 people, it's less than 1% of North Korean armed forces. That is totally affordable. And this 1% would be combat tested and combat hardened. That would be extremely useful for Pyongyang, right? And then, in doing so, North Korea might have what they best want from Russia, that is continuous economic support, including food and oil. But then there are three things in military fields, that is satellite, submarine, right, and missiles. Just imagine this. Even so long as the war continues, probably Russia will find itself somewhat obliged to give North Korea something in return, even in salami slicing manner. And that would be good for North Korea, given the huge gap in terms of military technology between Russia and North Korea.
Yeah, please go ahead.
If I may add a point, thank you, Ahmed. I actually recently attended a very important meeting about this DPRK soldiers in Russia. Allow me to mention several points. One is that the total size of the North Korean troops, currently at 12,000 troops, may be increased to 100,000 troops in no time. That's a lot of troops. Whether that will make break the deal, make the deal or break the deal, that's another issue. Now, DPRK gets handsomely paid, $1,000 per soldier per month. How much goes to the soldier's own pocket, that's another thing. But you may ask whether the DPRK is really looking at this from a monetary perspective. No. I think DPRK, that's my personal assessment, will definitely ask for two things. One is the advanced technology of miniaturization of the nuclear warheads from Russia, and Russia has one of the best technologies in that. The second is the technology to improve the accuracy and the range of their missiles, including their ICBM missiles. But on the other hand, I completely agree with Senior Colonel Zhou. Russia seems to be on the upper hand, and this President Trump factor will definitely make the Russian-Ukrainian war probably completely turn it upside down on its head. So I think Russia has the advantage right now.
Yep, Colin Zhou wants to intervene, but please make it short.
Just one word. Much has been talked about how there is an alliance led by the United States against an axis of China, Russia, and North Korea. This is total nonsense. The reason is very simple. Can you just remember when did China and North Korea did an exercise last time? I'm 61. I can't remember. Yeah. So unlike China and Russia, who would do exercise almost every year, we're not doing exercise with North Korea, in spite of we are close neighbors. So long as China and the U.S. relationship is manageable, there won't be such an alliance of the three countries.
Right. So now I would like to take the conversation closer to where we are, to the Gulf nations, and examine the implications of all that we discussed so far on the interests of Gulf states. And I would like to start with Dr. Gao, because Dr. Girgash earlier called President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed's visit to Washington historic visit. Part of this visit was signing a partnership with the United States on advanced technology, including AI. We saw investments between G42 here in the UAE and Microsoft on AI, and many other partnerships going to be implemented in the future. The pressing question I heard a lot here and from my colleagues who are from the Gulf, how does China see this close alignment between the United Arab Emirates and the United States on AI and advanced technology?
Thank you very much. I think you are touching upon very important points right now. First of all, between US and UAE in terms of scientific technological cooperation, China has no interest to say anything about it. It's completely between UAE and the United States. How you want to structure the cooperation, it's completely up to you. China has no position to say anything at all. But I do want to say one thing. The US strategy of the chips war, etc., seems to be focused on several things. They want to deny China's access to the advanced semiconductor chips. They want to deny China access to the advanced quantum computing and the algorithm. But they forget the third pillar, that is the power generation. China now generates more power than many of the G7 countries combined. And China has one capability of adding new power capacities using a variety of means. And China has the world famous, what we call high distance, long distance, high voltage power transmission, meaning you can transmit power at great distance from one side of China to the other side of China. Therefore, what China is doing is as follows. Let me be very clear. One is that, as I mentioned, China used to spend $400 billion US importing chips from the United States, from Taiwan province, from South Korea, etc. China was very happy to do that. China was not a rocker of the boat. But once the United States want to deny China's access, China did one thing and is doing that. China is plowing in billions of dollars to develop high-end chips. And I can venture out to make one point. I believe in a matter of 5 years to 10 years, China may not need to import any chips from anywhere else. What does that mean? That means the US semiconductor chips may be decimated because the US government is killing the largest customer of the semiconductor industry of the United States. How can you survive this brutal war of chips war if China eventually achieves complete self-reliance and no longer need to import chips from the United States or from any other country? Now, the second point is even more important. As happened in many other industries, once China achieves complete self-reliance, China will not just sell to its domestic customers, China will start to sell throughout the world. That means when China reaches self-reliance in semiconductor chips, the semiconductor chips price will plummet, as it has happened to all the other manufactured goods involving China. Meaning, China again will become a major factor, not only in the manufacturing of the semiconductor chips, but in global trade of semiconductor chips. Therefore, if you follow the chips war strategy of the United States under President Biden, It's not going to save the US semiconductor industry. In 5 to 10 years, the whole industry will be completely changed because China will be completely self-independent. Now, in terms of quantum computing, there is only one quantum computing satellite in orbit right now. It's a Chinese quantum computing satellite. So I don't think the United States can really keep an advantage, if there is any, ahead of China in computing or in algorithm. Now, the third pillar, as I mentioned, is even more important. Without power, you cannot really achieve your AI revolution. And that's the point for example, India. India has all the other things, but power generation, that's a weakness in India. In many other countries, power is always a problem. Vietnam suffers from power deficiency. And if China and the United States compete in the amount of power to be added in the coming few years, let me make a promise to you. China will keep the advantage for the coming decades. Therefore, if you look at all these pillars of the AI revolution, don't believe that China will be left behind. Don't believe that the US chips war strategy will succeed, because the more pressure you apply to China, China really breaks out into greater excellence. That's why I did not agree with the previous distinguished Indian panelist when he said China's technology, AI, etc., are substandards, etc. No. If you keep listening to what Washington has to say, they talk about no other country but China. Why? Because they think China is a pacing threat, because China keeps moving forward. And I'm so happy to see that in UAE, your cooperation with Huawei is so good. The phone Huawei produced has one advantage that no US company can do. That is instant, seamless connection with a satellite. You say, oh, satellites, SpaceX. No, SpaceX satellites are low orbit, only about 300, 400 kilometers above your head. The Huawei connection is to high altitude satellites, about 40,000 kilometers above your head. Instantaneous connection without an extended antenna. That is the Chinese high technology. That's the scientific and technological breakthrough. That's what President Xi Jinping keeps talking about, new qualitative productivity. Thank you, Ahmed.
Thank you. That was a great pitch for Chinese technology, and I'm sure the Chinese government will love that, especially here in the Gulf. But I would like to move on to India and take India's perspective on two things, two developments. Now we have regional escalation. We have the war, the conflict between Hamas and Israel in Gaza. Israel expanding its military power into Lebanon, and a region on the edge of perhaps a conflict between Israel and Iran. This puts burden on countries who consider to normalize the relations with Israel, including Saudi Arabia. How do you see the impact? And the other development I would like to bring in the question is Trump, of course, winning the elections, and we all know his position on multilateralism, especially. How do you see the implications of these two developments on initiatives such as I2U2 and IMEC, the corridor between India, the Middle East, and Europe going forward, not only under Trump, but even beyond?
See, all of the rising tensions, whether they be tensions in the South China Sea, which are disturbed, which can have the potential to disrupt supply chains, or the more serious problems today occurring in West Asia. We don't like calling it the Middle East, we call it West Asia. The problems in West Asia trouble India deeply. And India's strategy all along in this part of the world has been, you see, I kept on talking about our division of the Indo-Pacific. For us, this is also the Indo-Pacific. This is where the Arabian Sea, we call it. The Arabian Sea links us irretrievably to this. This is our connectivity corridor into Europe, into Russia, into Africa, into a whole other host of regions. So this region becomes extremely important. And India's involvement in multiple projects across this region whether they be the INSTC, whether they be IMEC, or the whole initiative on the I2U2, India wants to work with all partners. It's reached out. It reaches out to Iran, it reaches out to Saudi Arabia, it reached out to UAE, strong bonds, Israel. It even reached out to Israel to make the IMEC a possibility. And for us, that was important. Now, if there's a setback there, if there's not going to be peace in West Asia, our position, at least my position, is very clear. I don't know what Indian government thinks, but my position is very clear. This does not just have implications for India. It has far more serious implications for Europe. See, Europe cannot forget one basic fact which you keep telling them, that the problems of Europe which spill over across the Mediterranean are not going to be solved within the borders of European nations. They will drive the rift across Europe. Those problems will need to be solved here. That is where the problem is. And a solution has to be found for the peace of this entire Afro-Eurasian region. It's absolutely imperative, and imperative for all countries, including China, including West Asian countries, and Africa and Europe, to find a solution right over here. And the sooner we do it, the better.
Colonel Zhou, I would like to build on the earlier question of the instability in the Middle East right now. A lot of criticism directed towards China is that its approach is not really meaningful in terms of bringing stability and security to the region, and even carrying out meaningful mediation. The deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, China didn't do the heavy lifting in the mediation. China also invited the Palestinian factions to Beijing, and the Beijing Declaration, which didn't seem to me to be an agreement in itself. It's just a declaration on principles, general principles. The United States reached out to China many times to speak to the Iranians and the Houthis to tame down their attacks in the Red Sea, but China was not responsive, according to them. What do you say to these criticisms, especially when China is staying far away, lecturing the United States on what to do in this conflict without getting its feet wet?
Very good question, and it's really important for me to talk here about how China look at this region. First, let's look at China's diplomacy. Nowadays, everything that doesn't seem to have anything to do with China would end up having a lot to do with China. And why is that? Because China is too big. Because China is too important. China cannot hide itself behind a big tree, because China could be even taller than the tree itself. So, as a major power, China has to be involved in almost everything. And China is doing the right thing in this region. As Ahmed has mentioned, China has successfully mediated between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This would be a turning point in Chinese diplomacy for China's heavier and more busy involvement in the world. In this region, China, yes, apart from this mediation, at least China has been trying to bring 14 Palestinian factions to China. You know how difficult it is to herd the cats, right? But we at least have been able to herd the cats for a while to bring this Beijing Declaration. So that is good. Then we come to this region. The question is, all the people around the world would expect China to do more. The question is not whether China wants to do it or not. The question is how to approach all these issues. For example, China did talk to Iran, and through Iran, to Houthis, okay, you must behave, right? And this is already published in Chinese media from China Ministry of Foreign Affairs, from the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, from our representative to the United Nations, and it is even confirmed by American ambassador to China when Majority Leader Schumacher visited China. Yeah, they want Chinese leadership to talk to the Iranian counterparts. So China did all this. The question is that These countries want China to use sanction. That's a problem. Yeah. Why won't the Chinese leader pick up a phone to talk to Putin directly, to ask him to stop the war? You can do that. Only you can do that. And why don't you just, stop buying oil from Iran to ask Houthis to stop? You can do that. On this issue of Middle East, we believe what happened in the Red Sea comes from land. And that is a common sense because maritime issues are rooted on land. So we believe Gaza issue is the root causes. So this is our way of addressing this issue.
Please.
Thank you, Ahmed. Let me be very quick on several brief points. One is that, as a matter of principle, I'm very much amazed to see that more than 75% of the Israelis want to force Netanyahu out of the government. So, Prime Minister Netanyahu is very much of a problem in himself. Secondly, I'm always shocked by people in the United States who claim that the United States will give unconditional support to Israel. I always tell my friends in the United States, you need to amend that saying. You need to say, the United States will give unconditional support to Israel if Israel does the right thing. But if Israel does the wrong thing, shooting civilians, killing more than 40,000 civilians in Gaza, 75% of them are women and children, including pregnant women, the United States wants to give unconditional support to Israeli atrocities like that? It doesn't make any sense. So I hope all of us will agree, without the massive unconditional support of the United States to Israel, Israel cannot carry out these atrocities against the Palestinian people. Another quick point, that's my personal conclusion. The Palestinian people are as much human beings as the Israeli people or as the Jewish people. If anyone tell me that the Jewish people are more superior than the Palestinian people in Gaza, etc., they are telling you lies. The Palestinian people deserve to live on their own land as much as Israelis need to live on their own land. And if you have conflicts, you go back to the history. You go back to when Israel was created. What's the UN mandate, for example? And for the Israeli delegate to curse the United Nations, for example, which give the right of their birth in 1947, I believe, is really the highest level of ingratitude that any nation can demonstrate in the world of today. Therefore, if you look at the United Nations Security Council, China is the strongest voice in support of the two-state solution. And I met with the Palestinian ambassador to China just before I left on an extended overseas tour this time. We chatted for about 2 hours. And I was really very much moved by the Palestinian people's recognition of how much China has done. In the world, I've told everyone I know, you are not a real friend of the Arab people or of the Muslim people if you are not a real friend of the Palestinian people. If anyone tells you, I'm a friend of UAE, I'm a friend of Qatar, but I do not support the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people, he is a false friend. And China is a real friend of the Palestinian people. Yeah. That's the matter that matters.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank you, our speakers, for such insightful interventions. Thank you so much for our audience. Thank you.